is my great honor to welcome you all this afternoon in the name of all 6 organizers of this symposium at the History Department of Bielefeld University. I very much hope that you all had a good, smooth trip to East Westphalia, a region in Germany which many of you might not have had on their mental maps so far. It is encouraging and necessary that we come together and discuss about Ukraine, its historical development, its present situation and political future as part of Europe. Nevertheless, due to Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine, the background for such meetings could not be more terrible and dramatic. The dissolution of Soviet Union and Ukraine's arduous path to emancipate itself politically, economically, but also mentally from the heavy burden of the Soviet legacy, as well as Russia's destructive policy toward Ukraine up to the annexation of Crimea, the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine in March 2014, and finally the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 have fundamentally reshaped the image of themselves among the population of Ukraine and the expectations for a self-determined future. Such a re-perspectivization of Ukraine has also taken place outside Ukraine, of course, for example in Europe, in particular in Western Europe and Germany, less dynamically and often out of a complete ignorance of Ukraine's history and culture, but it is taking place and gaining momentum. This process of a new perspectivization of Ukraine ultimately also forms the background for the current exchange between Ukrainian and German-speaking scholars, such as at this symposium in Bielefeld and numerous other workshops and events, many of them even at the same weekend. And even those of us who have been dealing with Ukraine for a long time will in one way or another reorient or adjust their view on the history, the current and future development of the country and its people under the events of the war. In this regard, Valeria Korablyova will speak about an epistemological change that is taking part in the field of academic knowledge production in the course of Russia's war against Ukraine. As historians, we have an idea of how long-lasting and arduous such processes of a fundamental reorientation of our political and cultural ideas and the overcoming of traditional thought patterns are. But this should not discourage us. This brings me to the main idea and goal of this symposium and our workshop on teaching experiences on Saturday. The main purpose of this event is to bring together scholars from Ukraine and the German-speaking world, so basically Switzerland, Austria, and Germany, who work in the fields of Eastern European studies and peace and conflict studies. The workshop will critically reflect on the extent to which current events and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine have led to a changed perception and assessment of the history and current position of Ukraine in academia and public debate. In doing so, we want to discuss questions about an appropriate handling of Ukrainian histories in studies and teaching, with question about the role and status of Ukraine in peace and conflict research across disciplinary boundaries. This is, of course, not an easy task, but it is certainly worth the effort. And finally, of course, we want to bring together scholars from Ukraine and German-speaking countries to intensify the existing connections and create new intellectual ties, both individual and institutional. I would like to take this opportunity finally to express my sincere thanks to various people who have contributed significantly to the realization of this symposium and the accompanying workshop. So this takes some time. I'm sorry for that, but I think we should mention that. So I count on your patience in this point. There are, first of all, my dear co-organizers of this event. First of all, dear Yaroslav Zhuralov, who came first up with the idea of having such an event in Bielefeld, and who has done a fantastic job in organizing and conceptualizing this event. The same is true with regard to Cornelia Konczal, who pushed successfully the preparation of the symposium enthusiastically and in a very professional way. So thank you very much, Cornelia and Yaroslav, for spending so much time and energy in this undertaking. My sincere thanks go also to Gabriele Grinchenko. Hopefully she is at least digitally here, unfortunately not in presence, who is unfortunately ill today, who has been crucial in building bridges with Ukrainian and German experts and bringing her own broad expertise to the table. The same is true for Natalia Sienkiewicz and Franziska David, I've somewhere seen also here, who also provided us with valuable conceptual and organizational support. We greatly thank our cooperation partners, namely the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission, with personally Gabriele Grinchenko and Guido Hausmann, the Institute of Interdisciplinary Research on Conflict and Violence at Bielefeld University with Andreas Zick, as well as the German Association of East European Studies, or the German abbreviated DGO, with Gabriele Freitag. Nice to have you all here. Furthermore, as always, we are also thankful for valuable support from the German Foundation for Peace Research, die Deutsche Stiftung für Friedensforschung in Osnabrück, and with Ulrich Schneckener in person. Furthermore, as always, there have been and still are many helping hands of very kind people, among them Rita Geyer, I've seen her many times, the secretary at our history department, the student assistants, among them Jan-Philipp Berendes, Kira Meyerkort, Philipp Flüss, and Vitali Maliarsky. A video team around Nikita Malinovsky, sorry for not knowing all the names, and from IT support, Robert Vogel, as well as Olena Orlova, Pavlo Chutki, and Alisa Bondar from the Bielefeld Student Association Understand Ukraine. And last but not least, I would like to thank you all as participants of this symposium for being ready to come to Bielefeld to discuss and share your expertise with us. In particular, we are grateful to Guido Hausmann and Valeria Korablyova for giving the evening lectures and insights into the very topic of our symposium, as well as to Gabriele Freitag for chairing this section, and finally to Alexandra Matvichuk for joining us later this afternoon, at least digitally, and discussing with us. I wish everyone a stimulating discussions and a pleasant time here at Bielefeld University.
So just a few words from my side. My name is Guido Hausmann. I'm co-speaker of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. It's really a pity that Gabriele is not with us because she was speaking since months about this event, and she was very much looking forward for participating here, for being with us here, for discussing the topic with us here. So the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission is one of the organizing institutions. It is an institution established in 2015 by German and Ukrainian historians we are thinking of ourselves as quite an active institution with organizing annual conferences, with organizing PhD workshops, with organizing since the last year webinars on various topics, with fellowships we have, and other forms of activities. For instance, in September, we have had, this time in Warsaw at the German Historical Institute, our annual conference on early modern Ukraine. So we are happy to be one of the organizing institutions of this event, but I'm very grateful to Yaroslav Zhuralov and Frank Grüner and the team here in Bielefeld who has done the main body and the main work for preparing and for organizing this event. So thank you very much. Just 2-3 points. What of course is fascinating here is interdisciplinarity. To talk to colleagues from other disciplines, it's always a challenge, but it's always enriching and gives really different and other perspectives, often unexpected perspectives. So I'm looking forward for this. Then I want to make a little question mark behind the epistemological changes, because as a historian, I think in longer time periods, and of course, this is a big point. Do we really speak about epistemological changes or not? And my last point, just to throw in the word Israel and what is happening in Israel, and to see the links which are drawn in the media between Israel and Ukraine. And so we see already kind of what the scale of conflicts, of wars, how they are interrelated. And we have to take this up and reflect on this also as historians. So we see the huge challenges we have nowadays with Ukraine, with, if you like, Azerbaijan, Armenia, with Israel, Palestine. And I leave it with this. I'm looking forward to our event. Thank you.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, шановні пані та панове, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. 11 months ago, my Ukrainian colleague who came to Germany after February 24, and she was very homesick, suggested I organize a small meeting of Ukrainian scientists together for Christmas, small Ukrainian community, 5-7 colleagues. And I discussed with Professor Frank Grüner, and he agreed to support me. But as you can see, our planning has grown in scale. We can't stop in time. So now we have this event with dozens of participants, and I'm delighted that we managed to gather all of you here together. I want to thank our organization committee, our organizing team, and I counted that about 20 people were involved in the preparation. And everyone played a huge role. I'm sorry for the repetitions, but I would like to thank Natalia Sienkiewicz, Gnada Grinchenko, Francisco Davis. Thank you for your work and thank you for your help. Special thanks also to Olena Orlova, the head of the Student Association Understand Ukraine. And dear colleagues, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to see here in front of me such a brilliant audience, such bright minds. I want to express special words of thanks to my dear colleagues from Bielefeld University, Professor Frank Grüner and Professor Cornelia Konczal. Without your support would be nothing. This whole event is only possible thanks to your support. I'm very grateful to you for supporting my idea of this conversation about Ukraine. Not about Ukraine and Russia, not about Russia, which Ukrainians are helping to understand and to explain. Just talk about Ukraine as such. Call it a post-colonial approach, whatever. I know that Ukraine deserves separate conversations. Ukrainian studies is a huge and interesting field of scientific research, and I'm convinced that the development of Ukrainian studies in Germany will be useful for both Ukraine and Germany. Of course, we cannot avoid talking about the war. We all know and understand that, unfortunately, without February 24, this symposium would not have taken place. But we must also talk about peace. What will it be, and how do we want to see it? Today and tomorrow we will discuss Ukrainian studies and peace and conflict studies. And I'm grateful to Professor Ulrich Schneckener for his support and advice that helped us organize the symposium. These two fields of research are now very closely related. And today this conversation, this unification of these fields of study is even more relevant for all of us. All of us, we see new outbreaks of violence around the world. We all read the news from Israel, but in addition to Hamas, there is also Iran, there is China, and there is also Belarus and Lukashenko. What should we do? What can we do? How can we act? Because never again turned out to be just a slogan, just words that mean nothing. In my opinion, the end of the war, the end with the victory of Ukraine, and the punishment of the aggressor will be the essential first step of establishing a new long-term security architecture on the European continent, and maybe in the whole world. At least I really hope so. I have a few technical announcements to make. Bielefeld University is a unique place with extremely powerful history faculty, and I'm honored to be part of this faculty. The Department of History is located here in this building, Building X, and we will be working with you here today, tomorrow, and also on Sunday with those of you who are staying for the workshop. And by the way, Mensa is also in this building, Building X, which of course is very convenient for us. And tomorrow, all of you can have lunch in our Mensa. But we would also like to give you the opportunity to see our main building. This is a unique building. Each wing occupies a separate faculty, but all students of all faculties gathered in the central hall where they can communicate. This is a principle of interdisciplinarity is embodied in the architecture. In the central hall there are shops, a cafe, a bank, an insurance company, even a swimming pool. There is also a restaurant, and today we will have our dinner there, and I sincerely invite all participants to come. Dear colleagues, when we wrote to all of you our letters of invitation, we had practically no rejections. Almost all of you whom we invited agreed to come to Bielefeld. This shows that we all have a lot to talk about, and we have many questions to which we want to hear answers. So let's start our conversation. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to give the floor to Gabriele Freitag, Executive Director of the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Osteuropakunde. Dear Gabriele, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, Guido. So, thank you. Thank you, Frank, Guido, Yaroslav, for the introduction. Special thanks also from my side to the committee of this symposium for inviting DGO, the German Association for East European Studies, for inviting us as a partner. The German Association for East European Studies is a network of scholars, an interdisciplinary network of scholars who work on Central and Eastern Europe, on the South Caucasus and Central Asia, and reflecting, studying, and engaging across disciplines. This is the subtitle of our symposium today. Very aptly summarizes what DGO is all about and what is at the heart of our work. So all the more, we are happy to be a partner here, and I'm very happy and honored to chair the first panel here. So we've already heard it, but I want to stress it again. It is the aim of this symposium to bring and think together various interdisciplinary fields who allegedly have hardly shown any overlaps over the last 30 years. Especially we're talking about area studies and security studies. So far the aim of this symposium, and this is indeed striking if we take a look back to the genesis of area studies in the United States after the Second World War. So during the early years of the Cold War, regional studies in combination with communication studies became increasingly important in the United States to illuminate the structure of Soviet society in a systematic manner. And research, especially in the field of social science, but also beyond, also became an instrument of psychological warfare. I think this is something that we should have in mind, and it is very important to always have in mind this genesis also of area studies and the extreme importance it had for security issues in the United States and then, of course, in the transatlantic field as well. So apparently, with the Cold War coming to an end, regional and security studies drifted further apart. And we've already heard it, all the speakers have stressed that we are back to war. And unfortunately, not only in Ukraine, we've heard about Karabakh as well. And of course, we have all been very shocked by the recent developments and in Israel last week and the ongoing war there. And I find it very interesting, and I have already participated in many discussions over the last 1.5 years or nearly 2 years. The Russian war against Ukraine has triggered many discussions on the status quo and perspectives of area studies, and especially studies on Ukraine. And I think this is something that we will also discuss today and tomorrow. Frank Grüner has just mentioned overcoming traditional thought patterns is also one of the aims of this discussion. And I think the inputs that we will have tonight will be a great start for this. So we will start with keynotes from the field of history and from the field of political and social science. And both speakers will analyze also how the professional interest in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe has changed in their fields of expertise. And I'm very happy to introduce our speakers to you. Valeria Korablyova is a political theorist and cultural sociologist. She's the head of the research center Ukraine in a Changing Europe, which is based at the Institute of International Studies at Charles University in Prague. Welcome, Valeria.
Thank you.
Valeria's focus is on post-Soviet transformations in Ukraine and the region, and we might also talk about the term post-Soviet today and tomorrow, which is heavily discussed now. Valeria is especially interested in democratic imaginaries, mass protests, and questions of nation building. And she has, and this is especially important for us, has contributed to the discussion on broader implications of the Russian war against Ukraine for European political practices and structures of knowledge production. Because this is something that we will discuss tonight as well. Valeria has received her habilitation in 2015 from Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev, and for all her publications and also further research stays at other places, please check the papers that you find in the folder that you've received here. So I'm also happy to introduce Guido Hausmann, who has already welcomed you, but Guido is a historian who has dedicated most of his academic work to the history of Ukraine. Guido, you've started your academic career at Köln University. I think it was the first university in Germany, was really a special focus on the history of Ukraine. And so to call it in nowadays words, would call it a hub of Ukrainian studies. I think this is what it became, I think. And the field of Guido's research comprises university and scientific history, urban history, empires and nationalities, history of memory and cultural memory, and environmental history. And you will also find further information on Guido's publications in the folder that I've already mentioned. Guido is professor of history of East and Southeast Europe at the University of Regensburg, head of the Department of History at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg, and as you've already heard, currently co-speaker of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. So, Guido, we will start with a lecture by you, and maybe I will add a few questions afterwards, and then we'll immediately have the lecture by Valeria, and then we'll have a joint discussion. So Guido will speak about Ukrainian history studies in Germany and beyond, conjunctures, traps, and chances. Thank you, Guido.
So thank you very much, Gabi, for your very kind introductory words. I'm a dedicated historian, I have to say this, certainly. But the disciplinarity comes in then in our discussion, I think. So dear colleagues, the number of recent publications on Ukrainian historical scholarship and writing is considerable. I was surprised by the fact, while preparing myself for this talk, there's probably no other country in the world whose historiographical traditions, themes, and future prospects have been the subject of so much writing and debate, and not just since February 2022. I call Serhiy Yakelchik's Writing the Nation, the Ukrainian historical profession in independent Ukraine and the diaspora, published in this year by Ibidim Verlag. Volodymyr Kravchenko's recent new book, Ukrainian Historical Writing in North America During the Cold War, published as well in this year by Lexington Books. Then Official History in Eastern Europe, a volume edited by Andriy Portnov, Corina Amacher, and Victoria Seryenko, published in 2021 with Fibre Verlag, a result of a Swiss, Lithuanian, Polish cooperation, and then as well Serhiy Brzezinski's edited volume, The Future of the Past, New Perspectives on Ukrainian History, published in 2016 by Harvard Ukrainian Press. In addition, then, there are topic-specific historiographical publications, such as recent volumes on the Holodomor or on Ukraine in the 18th century, edited by Volodymyr Skrokin, Frank Sissin, and Zenon Kogut. And even before 2014, when the war against Ukraine started, some influential historiographical interventions and assessments appeared, such as the one on Ukraine transnational from 2011, or a discussion on Ukrainian studies in the journal Slavic Review in 1995, with an article, landmark article by Mark von Hagen, Does Ukraine Have a History? And comments by Andreas Kappeler, Yaroslav Isajevich, Serhiy Plochy, and Yuri Sliosky. So how can one interpret this veritable accumulation of publications? Certainly not as a sign of neglect of Ukraine by historians. There were neither reflections on Russia's war against Ukraine and its impact on our discipline. So as more recently we have in Germany, for instance, these reflections in the Jahrbücher für Geschichte Osteuropas or in the Historische Zeitschrift. They were pointing to changes in the historiography of Ukraine towards a globalizing field, thus to a longer-term change in the field. They also drew attention to the growing political significance of history in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. And they diagnosed thematic traditions and new orientations. Overall, they are more likely to be understood as mobilizing and orienting appeals. So what are the special features of these publications? I would like to mention a few striking focal points. The works published in North America mostly reflect North American diaspora traditions, in particularly intellectual traditions. Some personalities, such as Ivan Lysyak-Rudnitsky and his landmark publications from the 1960s and 70s, are particularly highlighted. Europe and its historiographical trends in the historiography of Ukraine are seen as rather marginal, in the sense of not setting the tone. And to a certain extent, that's justified. There are no comparable German language publications on Ukraine's diaspora traditions, partly because there were no significant influences on Ukrainian emigre historians living in Germany of Ukrainian emigre historians living in Germany as Dmitry Doroshenko, Natalia Polonska-Vasilenko, or Boris Kropnitsky. So the well-known Ukrainian immigrant historians of the first half of the 20th century, on historians in Germany in the post-World War II decades. If Ukrainian historians now regain a foothold in Germany, and hopefully do, such as recently Andrei Portnov, they do so without the direct influence of former diaspora historians. One surprising point from my reading is that some topics that are of central importance for German and European historical scholarship on Ukraine, especially the Second World War, are missing from all the publications mentioned, or the Second World War is at best the background for scholarly and political emigration. Although Sehi Plochy 2016 anthology contains an article by George Lieber on Ukrainians' experiences of violence between 1914 and 1945, the entire complex of German-Ukrainian violent relations or German violence against Ukrainians is not addressed in detail. Another related topic, which one looks for in vain in the mentioned publications, is the topic of Ukrainian history as part of European history and historiography. Although in German historiography, global history, so for instance the topic of Germany's colonial past, has recently also displaced the trend towards European history, no proposal is formulated at all as to how European history could be rewritten from a Ukrainian perspective. At most, one can see that Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Polish relations are receiving greater attention. The Ukrainian nation and nation building are an important topic in all of the above mentioned publications. Contributors address the suppression on narrow limits of the possibilities of addressing the topic in the Soviet period and the hesitant acceptance of the topic since the late 1980s and early 1990s. Or they address national traditions of intellectual history from the 19th century to the present day. Drahomanov, Rushevsky, Lipinski, Rudnitsky, and others, but less so radical Ukrainian nationalism. Ukrainian nation building and nationalism, however, has developed as an anti-imperial stance, which differed significantly from the imperial or colonial nationalism of the German Empire. And obviously, the two kinds of nationalisms have also had very different impact on later historical writing and have been very differently evaluated in later historical writing. What is interesting and important, however, is how the authors and editors of the mentioned volumes situate the historiography of Ukraine, especially national historiography, in the larger field of current historical currents. Sehi Plochy, for instance, saw, and I quote him, the relation between Ukrainian historiography and the main trends in global historiography as the main goal of his edited volume from 2016. And the volume takes up in various contributions the transnational turn, the return of the region, and questions of the representation of the past, Geschichtspolitik in Deutsch. On the other hand, the imperial turn, or the new imperial history, for instance, the contribution of Ukrainian history and historiography to the imperial history of Poland, Lithuania, Russia, or the Habsburg monarchy, comparative and intertwined imperial history, or the question of colonialism and decolonization are of less importance in all the volumes. Yakelchik, who has published a book on Ukrainian national history writing, published in this year, Yakelchik emphasizes in his recent book two valuable corrections to larger historiographical trends. On the one hand, he talks about incongruences and non-simultaneities between Western and Ukrainian diaspora historiography since the 1970s, 1990s. While Western historical scholarship has opened up to the social sciences in these decades, so Bielefeld, Ukrainian diaspora historiography at the same time felt compelled to produce a national narrative to defend Ukrainian history against Soviet Ukrainian historiography. In fact, the consequences can still be felt today in the lack of social and economic historical accounts of Ukrainian history. On the one other hand, Yakelchik sees Ukrainian national historiography per se as a practice of decolonization. Here we have the word, one of the key words of this year. Per se as a practice of decolonization, when he formulates, and I quote him, the notion of decolonization allows reconceptualizing the nationalizing reading of history as textual resistance to the Russian imperial narrative. So per se, writing about Ukraine is decolonizing the Russian imperial narrative, according to Yakelchik. So this discussions of these current publications somehow describes also the current historical scholarship of Ukraine as a field of intellectual and cultural power relation. It leads me from a German perspective to two conclusions. First, there's no close connection between German or European and Northern American historical scholarship on Ukraine on some important topics. World War II, Ukrainian history as European history, or comparative diaspora historiographies. And second, the opening up of Ukrainian history to translational and global history, for instance, to questions of decolonization, may also open up new possibilities for cooperation, which we should take up. So what kind of knowledge on Ukraine do we need, and how should we produce it? And I think both questions are closely related. And I would like to stress a few points. First, research on Ukraine should be conducted jointly with Ukrainians, as we do it, for instance, in the German Ukrainian Historical Commission. This can be understood as part of a process of decolonization. In a longer way, in a longer view, this can be understood also as a break with the past. The Ukrainian diaspora in Germany did not play a larger role until 2014 in historical research on Ukraine, but forms of cooperation between German historians and colleagues in Ukraine have developed since 1991. Historically speaking, the Ukrainian immigration in Germany in the interwar and post-World War II period had remained largely isolated from German academia. This has been a failure and should not happen again. With a larger number of historians from Ukraine residing in Germany, since last year, we aim at developing new forms of cooperation at our universities and larger research institutes. In addition, a German-Ukrainian Historical Institute in Kiev would be helpful in this regard, as it could institutionalize exchange and joint historical research. First point. Second, Some of the research we have to do now, we should have done earlier on. And we need to catch up. And let's say we, I mean German historians who explore the history of Ukraine. On a basic level, we need historical research on Ukrainian-German relations in broader contexts. For instance, on cultural brokers in the 20th century. Martin Schulze-Wessel has recently put Ukraine in larger political context since the early 18th century, in particular of Prussia's and Russia's imperial politics. He has shown the importance of role of Poland in Russia's historical imagination of Ukraine and pointed to the rather weak or loose Prussian-German-Ukrainian political relations. And I think that we have to broaden the perspective, that we have to go beyond the sphere of political relations. In order to get a fuller picture of German-Ukrainian historical relations. The lack of such research is a clear sign of a legacy of cultural imperialism and of asymmetrical power relations between Germany and Ukraine, which had to be overcome as part of a new Europeanized historical scholarship. We have to give voices to Ukrainians and also to Germans who entangled Germany and Ukraine. To give you some examples, I will start with the Holodomor studies. It is well known that no German historian has produced so far a book on the Holodomor or on the German population in Ukraine in the times of the Holodomor. Less known is that the Kiev publisher Academia published in 2014 the book Любовь и муки Magdy Roman, Die Liebe und die Leidenswege von Magda Roman, in German and in Ukrainian. It is called documentary and contains a number of original letters from Magda Roman from Podylia during the Great Famine to one of her brothers in northern Germany. During World War I, the peasant soldier from Podylia, Oleksandr Kuczynski, was detained as prisoner of war to northern Germany, close to Hamburg. There he fell in love with the rural laborer, Tagelöhnerin Magda Roman. In 1921, both decided to settle down in his home region of Podylia to establish themselves as peasant farmers and to start a family, as he is enthused about village life in Podylia. In fact, they, with their newborn twins, ended up in a poor rural life in Ukraine in the 1920s. The husband of Magda and some relatives died in the famine. Magda Roman never returned to northern Germany, but died in a labor camp in Russia after World War II. The book is, to my knowledge, so far unique. For the time period of German occupation of Ukraine during World War II, there are many more recorded Ukrainian voices, not least of Ukrainian forced laborers who lived in Germany, who visited Germany then since the 1990s and gave interviews in Ukraine or Germany on their life under German rule. I point here also to the recently published daily diary from Olga Kravtsova, edited by Tanya Penta. Olga Kravtsova collaborated with the Germans from 1941 to 1944 as a translator and died after the war in a labor camp in Russia. For the time period after 1945, for instance, transnational intellectual biographies of Boris Levitsky or Bogdan Ossadchuk, important public Ukrainian voices in West Germany, could become valuable case studies of entangled history reflecting marginal positions in the cultural and political sphere of West Germany. To let the voice of ordinary Ukrainians and Germans be heard, to make the agency of hetero-marginalized intellectuals visible, adds not only to our knowledge, but is an essential part of decolonization. And in this process, it is important to show the political, social, and cultural inequalities that constituted the framework of the agency. Third, international politics, in its narrower sense, also deserves its place in an analysis aiming at decentering and decolonizing our perspectives on actors, historical narratives, and power relations. Armistice and peace negotiations are of key interest at the moment. So the peace negotiations between the Central Powers, Ukraine and Soviet Russia at Brest-Litovsk at the end of World War I can be a fruitful case study for collaboration between historians with interest in diplomacy and political scientists with expertise in international relations and international law, or peace and conflict researchers. The negotiations ended with two peace treaties, one with Ukraine, the other with Soviet Russia, which brought Russia as an empire to an end. However, with the defeat of the Central Powers by the end of 1918, the treaty was cancelled. There's a long tradition in German historiography to highlight the peace treaty with Soviet Russia and to term it Diktatfriede, pointing thus to its unjust character for Imperial Russia, which lost large territories at its western periphery. So as the peace treaty with Ukraine recognized the country for the first time in modern history as a state, it is of high relevance for Ukraine, and it is worth studying the negotiations from an Ukrainian perspective as a historical moment of decolonization. Language played a crucial role in this context. The Ukrainian delegation successfully spoke up against the Soviet-Russian delegation, denying it the right to negotiate a peace with the Central Powers on Ukrainian territories and its people. His memoirs from 1930, Trotsky, who led the Soviet-Russian delegation, denigrated the Ukrainian delegation as provincial and democratic thugs. But the Ukrainian politicians successfully averted the attempt of the Soviet-Russian to weaken Ukrainian legitimacy by including two Ukrainian delegates from Soviet Kharkiv in its delegation. So to decolonize historiographical traditions of past peace negotiations and treaties, it is crucial for negotiating stable peace treaties today, and it is our task as historians to accomplish this. Fourth, the same might be also the case for historical research on national identification and the meaning of nation and state for Ukrainians in specific historical situations in imperial, European, and global contexts. We do have excellent books in Germany on Ukraine and its history, including recent translations from English. But further research is needed, which takes Ukraine out of the Russian orbit and places it in different historical and political contexts. We need in particular historical research which makes the German reader knowledgeable of what anti-imperial nationalism means in the Ukrainian case, as a practice of resistance or non-compliance. This is a very different path from the imperial or state nationalism which the German public knows about its own history. We need studies on the question of political sovereignty in Ukrainian history, from early modern times on, as a fluid, processual category. It is Germany's history of violence and colonialism towards Ukraine that together with Ukraine's lack of political sovereignty in the post-war period, has made German society and politics forget Ukraine. They are responsible for seeing Ukraine in 2014 and 2022 in association with violence, catastrophes, war, and nationalism. It is only in some areas, like the topic of forced labor, where there has been a critical reappraisal since the 1990s. In Central Europe, East Central Europe, the picture is somewhat different. At a time when Ukraine was absent from the German public, so the 1960s to the 1980s, 90s, the Czech writer Milan Kundera, who lived in exile in Paris at the time, mentioned it in a telling footnote. In 1986, in his essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe, he wrote in footnote number 3, I quote him, "One of the great European nations, there are nearly 40 million Ukrainians, is slowly disappearing. And this enormous, almost unbelievable event is occurring without the world realizing it." His essay was essentially about Europe, not just Central Europe. He began by talking about the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 by the Soviet army, and quoted the director of the Hungarian news agency as saying, I quote him, "We are going to die for Hungary and for Europe," end of quote. To conclude, the word Europe does not represent a phenomenon of geography, he says, but a spiritual notion synonymous with the word West. And we find similar semantics in 2014 and 2022, also in Ukraine. I'm in support of further opening up historical writing on Ukraine by going beyond topics with a focusing on the nation. As a rule, these topics are addressed in the larger framework of historical scholarship on Russia. Here, Ukraine remains an isolated case and a corollary of studies on nationality policies or related imperial topics. I see serious obstacles for applying approaches as, for instance, decolonization without developing a solid body of literature on the social rural-urban relations, for instance, and the economic history of Ukraine, on the history of knowledge of Ukraine, or on the history of the sciences and technology in Ukraine. We should avoid discussing decolonization while having only a nebulous idea about Ukrainian society. How can we assess Ukrainian agency without such knowledge? Is there not a danger of essentializing the colonizer and the colonized as a victim? Question mark. I come to some concluding remarks. At the beginning of my talk, I have taken a closer look at some recent publications on the historiography of Ukraine, mostly from North American colleagues. And in many respects, at least in my view, we are interested in the same concept and themes which are outlined in these books. However, in some respect, the German perspective on Ukraine also differs. And other themes are of primary importance. Other spatial relations matter. In the area studies before 2022, Eastern Europe was increasingly conceptualized as a globally connected place and scrutinized for its entanglements and comparisons. Since then, all of a sudden, regional knowledge about Ukraine, its places and regions, acquired a political value and significance. It also has acquired an unprecedented cultural importance. This knowledge became re-territorialized but this time it became embodied in concepts beyond the nation state of Ukraine, as part of knowledge about Europe and the world. At the moment, a deterritorialized approach towards area studies dominates, which conceptualizes areas through interaction, communication, and representation. In this sense, area can thus be elsewhere, as evidenced, for example, by the many men and women of the diaspora from and in the region. Ukraine and Eastern Europe took place, for instance, in Bavaria, where various emigre groups harbored and communicated designs for their homeland, not just among themselves, but through, for instance, international radio channels. The full-scale war on Ukraine in 2022, after Russia's conquest of the Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine in 2014, reminds us in Germany of the fact that Ukrainian studies, as Eastern European studies in general, were shaped more than other fields by politics and wars. And political conjunctures from the very beginnings of this study field in the early 20th century. In 2022, the lack of knowledge on Ukraine among politicians and in the broader public became immediately obvious, in particular the lack of historical knowledge. Shaped by widespread Russophile sentiments in German society and politics, disinformation spread in an incredible speed, fostering misconceptions, prejudices, and fierce public struggles, but also to changes in Germanist politics and to a growing interest in Ukraine and its history. Decolonization is still a rather vague term and perspective, but if it enables us to give agency to Ukrainians in history and presence, to reflect power relations and inequalities European-wide and globally, to rethink dominant spatial relations, then it certainly has its value for us. Our task is that Ukraine is not becoming again footnote number 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guido. You will have the opportunity to pose questions after we'll have the next lecture. But let me just ask you, because in the end, Guido, you called for a deterritorialized approach towards area studies, giving the example of talking about diasporas. But could you, so what would be gained from such an approach? What is new about this approach when we talk about area studies?
I think what we talk about in the past years is something like trans-regional area studies.
Yeah.
So to put a region like Eastern Europe or with Ukraine, maybe in the center, in a global context. And I think this is not different from the area studies in the 1950s, in that sense that at that time, area studies were also part of a global thinking. Mm-hmm. But it is different in the sense that it is not thought about Eastern Europe and Ukraine from the US just, but it is to put the region in focus and to think about the wider world from the region or from various regions in this world. And I think this is different. Mm-hmm. It reflects power relations differently.
Well, thank you. We will talk about, you've mentioned power relations in various contexts. We will come back to that as well in the discussion. But I would then ask Valeria for her talk now, for her lecture on, let me give you the title once again, Russia's War as an Epistemological Challenge, Banal Imperialisms in the interdisciplinary knowledge production. I think your title is a challenge in itself. So we're looking forward.
Hopefully productive one. Thank you so much. Thank you all. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience, and I'm honored to be at this very important conference because as a sociologist by training, Bielefeld has been on my mental map, due to Nicholas Luhmann at least, right? So it's like really a pleasure to be here, and many thanks for organizers to giving me this opportunity to share my ideas and to engage in this important conversation. So once we are engaged into an interdisciplinary endeavor, it starts with formal things. You know, my colleagues told me, if a historian comes unprepared to a conference, they do not have a text. For sociologists, you must have PowerPoint presentation. So I will give you a couple of slides to illustrate the points I'm trying to put forward. When I looked at the title of this conference, I started thinking, War and Peace, I'm reminding you. Somehow it brought some allusions to Tolstoy to me, who is very much in the center of decolonization debates today. And then I thought, oh, actually it has so many levels and layers open to interpretation, because there were these debates that there was one copy of the book with a different transliteration of the word peace, and some people were arguing that actually the title is War and the World. And that's very much the topic of my today's thinking, that the war has shaken the world, but our perception and our attempts to make meaning of this war is mediated through knowledge we uphold. And therefore we need to keep a closer focus on the content, but also at the structures of knowledge production at large. And that would be the focus of my presentation. So I'm trying to wed so diverse, in many sense, domains as history, social sciences, and peace and conflict studies by this meta position which is allowed by the sociology of knowledge. And this cover from famous Thomas Kuhn's book gives a hint in this direction, that I hope that we are living through a potential paradigm shift. It's not yet an epistemological change, as Frank kindly prefigured in his speech, but more like a challenge which might result in a change or not. But we need some consolidated, concerted effort in this direction. So not surprising, I would start with the word of the day, decolonization. On the one hand, we have many conferences, articles, publications, and debates, people coming from very different disciplinary backgrounds talking about decolonization. However, there is a risk that it can turn either in a buzzword that loses its meaning through constant iterations in media and other settings, or just a moral gesture on the side of the Western public that basically morally blames the war of aggression on the side of Russia and Ukraine, and that would be it. But what can actual decolonization mean? What are the steps and implications? And many thanks, Guido, for starting this conversation and for your brilliant presentation, and especially for passing the ball with Kundera. We are talking about footnote number 3 with my students extensively all the time, so it's very nice how you gave me an opportunity to step in. So the issue number 1, which has been mentioned already, is that many Western experts and scholars have used knowledge on the East European region at large, which was produced, mediated, and centered around Russia. And therefore, if we need to do something like that, around that, to rectify for this distorted structure of knowledge production on the region, we need to withdraw Russia's right to speak for or on behalf of its neighboring polities, because we remember that subalterns cannot speak, right? So we need to give them voice and opportunity and the platform to voice to establish their agency by voicing their perspectives. Then we need to expose and denounce the Russocentric character of Slavic and East European studies in Western academia, not to the same extent in different settings, but more or less it is present everywhere, that Russia has always been the main focus of research endeavors in different localities outside of the region. And then, of course, if we deterritorialize, to invoke Deleuze and Guattari's notion, if we clean the space, then we need to fill it with something else, and ideally we need to fill the blank spots of this in-betweenness, these lands in between centers of power. We need to fill it with specific knowledge coming from the region, by local scholars and local voices and local agencies and perspectives to overcome this pre-existing epistemic blindness. But basically, the region, for a long period of time, has been largely a blind spot, which was consciously and intentionally ignored by the broad public. These are steps in the right direction, but we cannot stop there. So we have further stumbling blocks on the way, I'm arguing. Issue number 2, as I put it, is that what about the status of Slavic studies themselves in the overall structure of the academic division of labor? Now the situation is getting better, and many well-reputed historians are invited to public platforms, to meet politicians, to diplomatic circles, to invest their expertise to produce more well-rounded decisions, hopefully, in the political domain. But still, I would argue that Slavic studies largely remain peripheral in the academic division of labor. And even more importantly, it's not only that policy making is not connected to the expertise on the region, but also insights from the region barely inform the so-called universal disciplines, social sciences. And here I can give an example quite aptly illustrated by Gwendolyn Sasser in her keynote speech at BASIS conference this year. She was trying to publish a book in not in an area studies journal, but in general political science journal. And then she was suggested just to drop the word Ukraine from the title at least, so that it can be publishable. So that's the situation. If you get some insights from the region, it's very hard to prove that it's valid outside of the region, that it informs the general theory as such. And that is quite a problem. And I would think that it might be rooted in this labeling of the region as non-important and backward and in a way not universalizable, or sort of not conducive to universal generalization that can be useful for people living or interested in some setups and places outside of the region. So for me, it testifies in the direction of the unfinished work of de-imperialization of knowledge production. So by claiming that we're sticking to the agenda of decolonization, we should not only decolonize from the Russian imperialism, but also from some remnants of epistemic imperialism on the side of the West. Because the foundational belief, often not articulated but implied, covertly, is the West, is the vanguard of civilization, and therefore only experiences in the core Europe are relevant beyond its borders and are potentially universal or universalizable, and others are negligible because it's only niche knowledge. And then I thought that I have another look at Michael Bilec's famous book, Banal Nationalism. If you remember the argument, he's telling that we tend to think, and by we now I'm kind of trying to stick to the Western audience, we tend to think that nationalism is something peripheral, external, dangerous, and bad. We do not have it, we have patriotic feelings at best, but not nationalism. However, he claims that very much the established nations are being continually flagged because the nationhood and the national sentiments is actively reproduced by routine practices on a daily basis without being pointed to and without naming this word. And he says that the established nations are those states that have confidence in their own continuity. And then interesting quotation, which is, I believe, relevant for our conversation, is that from the perspective of Paris, London, and Washington, places like Moldova, Bosnia, and Ukraine are peripherally located on the edge of Europe. So you notice the jump between cities and countries in the first place. And then, so nationalism is there. It's not merely an exotic force, but a peripheral force. And the entire endeavor of Michael Bielek is sort of to rectify for that and to show that nationalism is deeply rooted, without being misnamed, in the Western society. But then rereading his argument with a fresh eye after 2022, I saw that actually it can be easily applicable to banal imperialism. So I'm trying to play with words here, because when he opens the book with all the rhetoric on the high level from top officials in the United States related to the invasion of Iraq, and they say that it is protecting and exposing American nationalism, I would argue that it at least as much exposes and shows the fight for imperial or post-imperial hegemony, and that would be called banal imperialism. So let's try just playing and replace that with imperialism, and I try to do that. But basically the established nations in them there is a continual flagging or reminding of greatness. And the established nations are those states that have confidence in their own privilege. And if reading through these, maybe methodologically a bit dubious, but I hope at least insightful reading of Bielig, then we can see that actually this kind of externalization, that nationalism is not something inherent in us, applies to imperialism as well, because imperialism is often externalized temporarily. That's like a historic fact. It's like the thing of the past, we are done with that. It's no longer present in our political contemporaneity. Maybe not that much so. And now I'm bringing in the bunch of decolonial scholars. And that would be the privilege of a sociologist as opposed to historian, because we are very much interested not in the historical facts, whether those places can be called colonies, but it's more about the mindsets and the sentiments, whether people feel being othered, second-rated, discriminated in a continuous structural way. And if you look at this group of nice scholars with African, Latin American, Asian, whatnot background, they're trying, like Dion, for instance, Gugi or Kano, Lostanova, Mignola, of course, and they're making the claim that actually ending with an empire politically is not enough, because cultural imperialism outlives the political phenomenon of colonization, and it continues influences people's perception and worldviews through structures of knowledge. And Mignola calls them knowledge power, that they are conflating, converging, and through knowledge production, they secure these asymmetric power balances that Guido already mentioned in his presentation. Therefore, in this declared quote-unquote post-imperial era in the Western world, I believe that imperialism is still there. It just got on this banal, mundane level when it is routinized, naturalized, but it reproduces this framework of perception that are based on the ideas of greatness vis-a-vis smallness and these hierarchies of cultural differences, which places, people, localities, and nations are important and which are really negligible. And the main issue I'm seeing in this context, that basically Putin's rhetoric, it appeals to the banal imperialisms in the West. When it's, we need to talk at a par because we are co-equal in our cultural and political power, and all the others just must surrender, bandwagon, or being ignored. And that's the plea that should be taken, disregarding the content, but structurally, that it appeals to this underbelly of the worldview that can be traced in some cases in the West. Not everywhere, but we might need to bring it to our attention. Epistemic symptoms. There is a huge body of literature on decolonization and on the colonial legacies in the knowledge production. Chakrabarty, the principle first in Europe, then elsewhere, studying the rest just out of epistemic curiosity rather than expecting them to contribute to the universal. When any difference is interpreted as deficiency, if you are not like us, then something is wrong with you, and then you are on like lower level of cultural hierarchies, and then of course distancing. If we sense that we have a cultural distance between us, then somehow it translates or is being transposed to geographical and historical distance. What Umland calls galactic imagining and Fabian calls denial of coevalness. We are as if living on different planets and different universes. And I would argue that's why also the war was not only an epistemological, but also an existential shock, because it's too close. The danger comes from the region that we imagine to be like very far from us culturally, and therefore like geographically, and sort of feeling like being immune because it's too far away in many regards. Culturally, that means geographically and historically, but it's not, for better or for worse. So once again, to reiterate this point, that non-West is perceived as a field where we can gather empirical data, but not a site of knowledge production. When people are perceived as tokens of their culture, but not epistemological agents who can produce knowledge on its own. Program of deimperialization. So what needs to be done? And here I believe that the positionality of Eastern Europe is quite specific. Unlike most decolonial scholars that are usually suggesting some like radical programs with quote unquote to turn their back on Europe, Eastern Europe very much, which is packed in the name, very much associates itself with Europe, and therefore it's the idea to contribute to change the power balances inside rather than discarding the European legacy altogether. So we just need to question whether what we perceive as universal knowledge is really universal, because it is usually coming from a very specific cultural and historical context. So it needs to be recontextualized, and its universal validity needs to be questioned seriously. And then we need to bring local perspectives and to see their potential for being universalizable. And for that matter, we can somehow balance the system in a way that I call peripheralizing the universal, globalizing the local. That would be the motto of this endeavor that I'm putting on the table. The three-world epistemology I will skip probably because I want to move to another buzzword. I've talked about decolonization, now I will say a couple of words about Zeitenwende, which was the local big word, at least of the last year. And I like thinking about it because I've heard many different interpretations, but I do like thinking about Zeitenwende as metanoia, as this opportunity of the mind shift, sort of changing the perspective. And here I'm quoting not Chancellor Scholz, but Steinmeier, Frank Walter Steinmeier, who exactly a year ago gave a very specific speech, and I'm particularly interested, of course, this Stimmung of uncertainty, this feeling that something is changing and we need to deal with, to cope with that, ideally in a quite organized, systematic way. But especially this quotation, the Russian attack is an attack on all of the lessons that the world had learned from the last century's two world wars. So top political leadership suddenly accepts the possibility that we might need to revise the historical lessons, and maybe what is going on today helps us to retrospectively rethink, reinterpret what we used to take as valid and almost natural. IPA, it's not a Yale, it's not beer, but it's international peace architecture. So I was trying to bring, again, being an outsider, I'm not doing peace and conflict studies, but I decided just to show this idea of tentatively universal knowledge, which is not really informed by insights from Eastern Europe, however, is being intended to actively being applied there. Sorry for this cumbersome grammatical construction. So what about the liberal peace order? I think the foundational belief, as I see it again as an outsider, and of course it's like a caricature picture because it's like a big picture, that basically as allegedly the main beneficiary and the winner of the three entangled wars of the 20th century, by them implying two world wars and the Cold War, that the West knows the secret of peace and order. And this foundational myth that we know how to transform tensions into collaboration and how to replace military means with economic interdependence, that's sort of the secret recipe that fits all. And interestingly, I see that structurally this epistemological authority is rooted in this feeling of being victorious, but it debunks the concept of the victor's peace, which is very much the stumbling block between Ukrainians and Western colleagues discussing possible solutions and bringing peace in Ukraine today. So historically embedded axioms in that field. The enemy should not be defeated completely, because World War I was resolved in a bad way and it led to World War II, so we need to learn from that lesson and we need always to meet in between, to find a middle ground. Ideally, we should look for diplomatic, not military solutions. Therefore, any supplies of weapons is an escalation. Then the paramount role of international institutions above all, already mentioned economic interdependence, and also too interesting perception of themselves and the main significant others. So it's very much still based on this magnetic appeal and soft power of the West, but also Soviet Union is Russia, also an interesting kind of equation, and it is perceived as an indispensable pillar of the European security order. And this bunch of axioms very much defines thinking in the direction how to bring peace in Ukraine, because if you apply all of that, it does not work. And even more so, very few Ukrainians would agree on these kind of recipes, not because of their ideological reason, but because of questioning their efficiency. Just some examples, not to go personal, but to show you concrete people who are this well-reputed scholars in peace and conflict studies, like Roger McGinty and Oliver Richmond. And you see it once and again, like Roger McGuinty on Twitter, he acknowledges that he has no expertise on Ukraine whatsoever. He literally says, I won't tweet on Ukraine because I don't have any regional expertise on the region. And it did not take like much time to break this promise and to make a lot of comments on Ukraine. And then quite recently, in August this year, he published a book review in Peace Building Journal where he basically reproduces in one way or another those underlying assumptions of the study that are informed by the European history, but they might be not applicable in this specific case. And what he is trying to say that basically it is very difficult to stand up for peace in relation to Ukraine because many Ukrainian commentators seem to like the militarized victory and they do not want to bring peace to the area. And then we have Oliver Richmond, who also gives his interpretation of the sides involved in this conflict, and he talks about militarized authoritarian nationalism in Russia, not imperialism. And then he talks that it is meeting nationalist ideologies in the region that are competing with Western versions of liberal peace. I think your intense look signifies that I need to close to my conclusions to come closer to them. So what I'm trying to say, this turbulent environment we find ourselves today opens a window of opportunity to meet and start listening to each other seriously. And then that's where historians, social scientists, and people who are well informed on the region might bring some insights. And there is just the need to be open to hear and to adjust and to refine our theoretical frameworks that might be working or not in this situation. So that would be the reading of history, which is for another story probably. So to conclude, if I have not challenged enough people now, then I will challenge Eric Hobsbawm. So I would say that maybe the short 20th century is not over yet. And maybe that's another misreading of or at least, I'm not saying that that reading is wrong, but maybe we were too clouded with the perception of the Cold War and with triumphalism of the end of history, so that we somehow missed the imperial trend in the 20th century, which is not over yet. And what Timothy Snyder suggests these days is this imperial reading of the 20th century and of the EU project, and that is along this line that it can be revised. And now we have many voices who say that the age of empire is not yet, because we still have a huge European land empire still standing and waging a very aggressive colonial war and implying very harsh colonizing policies on the reoccupied territories. So the pending task is at least twofold: to defeat Russian political imperialism, but also to deconstruct epistemic imperialism in other places that it appeals to and clicks with. And to that end, we need to revise universal theories as culturally embedded and hence limited in their application, inform those theories with insights from previously blind spots, and to turn from the idea of knowledge power to knowledge experience, and to allow people coming from the region with their embedded and embodied knowledge to produce well-informed statements. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Even if we may not yet see epistemological changes, you've given us a lot of examples for paradigm shifts, certainly. So, and I find it very interesting that you say that the term universal in itself is problematic, or what we associate with universal and what we do not associate with it, and that you call for revisions on the content of universal disciplines. I would call it maybe a kind of mainstreaming of area studies in these so-called universal disciplines. So how could that work?
So I think your question goes in the direction, not the ideas, but like practical solutions. So how can it work in practical, like in real life?
What would this imply? Because I think it is very important, and this is something that we also discuss within the German Association for East European Studies, that you always have a look at, let's say, Europe, and then you have Central and Eastern Europe, and you don't see it as a part. And if it comes to theories, you always go back to theories from studies on, let's say, Western Europe or the United States, while you hardly ever have studies on Eastern Europe or Central Europe that are then accepted as theory building. And so how would this mainstreaming work? What would have to be done?
Well, as a person teaching in university for many years now, I do believe in education. And I think when we are training the new generation of scholars, we need to fight with these imperial legacies and this distorted perception. So if you're doing a research in some place which is not the core European place, do not take difference as deviation with bad implications. Think it as something that can potentially enrich your theory and your knowledge. But then you need to rigorously prove that it is the case, that it's not a deviation indeed. So to open up their minds, because decolonization is very much, it starts with decolonizing of minds. So if we open our perception to the thing that we can enrich our theory and to balance this hugely Western-centric perception and perspective with other perspectives, that would be the way to go. If you're asking me not to think proactively about a new generation of scholars, but that's very Kuhnian response, right? Because Kuhn says that paradigm changes when generation changes, right? But we still need to move in this direction. And that means engagement. And this conference is one of the endeavors in this direction when we are meeting and trying, despite our varying vocabularies, methodologies, approaches. So it's not easy. Even if we all now speak English as lingua franca, we speak very different scholarly and scientific languages. So we need to try, the way we are trying to learn other languages, we try to open and hear each other and see how we can build bridges among ourselves. And I think in Germany, the situation is better as compared to North American countries, because you do have this specific regional social sciences, which is a good platform to be. It must be better integrated in social sciences writ large, but also the connection with area studies should be more intensive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Before I open for the floor for questions from you, Guido. Yeah.
Maybe just to say from a historian side,
Yeah.
decolonization or political emancipation in the post-World War II decades. So many countries of the world who have been part of colonial kind of subjugation became independent. So that's what we do when we speak of decolonization. When it comes to knowledge production, then of course it becomes difficult for us, because then it's blurred the border between what is decolonization and post-colonialism. Now we have no sharp differences and no sharp understanding of the terms which we most probably need if we want to apply the term decolonization. If it's about the universal understanding of terms, that's of course crucial when it comes to peace and peace negotiations. But it also, for us, it has always been a task to understand what is understood by nationalism in the Anglo-American context and in the German context and in the East European context. And that we have to somehow deconstruct also the language of politicians, and in the past year, above all, maybe the language of the Russian leader Putin, and so on and so on. I think that's our task, and it's also historically speaking our task when we somehow analyze speeches and languages of past times. So in that sense, I would say that terms and are culturally embedded, that it's part of our profession, I would say.
I think if you don't want to employ the term decolonization, I think it is all. You can also talk about new perspectives on center and periphery. A decentralization maybe also helps if you don't want to talk about colonization. But I will open the floor now for questions and comments
I can quickly comment on that, because of course you're right, and the initial development of post-colonial studies took these classical maritime empires, and then like also in a very cliched way, and omitting different like hybrid identities and positionalities there, so we tend to perceive it like that. However, the further development in reach historically and geographically, and if we talk about decolonization in terms of Latin America, they go far back to the 15th century, right? And they talk about like very different type of colonization. And they very much talk about precisely the fact that you can politically emancipate, but then live on the same track with that inherited structures. So it's good, but it's not enough. So it needs to be done. And then they recognize a huge amount and paramount importance of the language, culture, and knowledge, education and science. And that's the track we're finding ourselves today, because we talk very much about the Russian language as the language of communication, the literature, the structures in academia, in education, secondary education. So it is relevant, it resonates. I'm not saying that it should be like transplanted from one ground to another one. And also, like the recent developments in post-colonial and decolonial studies is very much informed by feminist and gender studies. And these ideas of epistemic violence, epistemic injustice is also quite helpful, and I'm referring to my colleague Vitaly Chernetsky now, who is very much working on that, just like an add-on to this methodology, so it's much more diverse today and developed. Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll collect questions, and it would be very helpful if you introduce yourself briefly. Okay, Veronika Wendland, if I see correctly, yeah? Okay. Can you speak up a bit, because
I try. I wanted to ask Guido to speak up because we can't hear him sitting, so he has to stand up in order to have us.
Okay.
I could not understand very well what he said. But the other I wanted to ask was a question to Valeria. When you referring to this, replacing the knowledge power connects by the knowledge experience connects. Could you break down that into some ideas about a research program which would be shifting from the power to the experience? Because I could really share my experience with experience, but in my research on Ukraine and in comparative German-Ukrainian research, which is because it is transdisciplinary and it is transregional, it is rather difficult to organize within the typical German university schedule and this typical German university research program. So could you develop a few ideas how to get it into the practice for us as researchers? Thank you.
Okay, Valeria.
Thank you so much. That I'm very pleased that it resonated with you, and I'm afraid that I do not have a good recipe because it's very like early stages, right? So it's just like an intuition, and that we need to disentangle knowledge from power and not take it as a tool for bettering your social position. And of course, academia is very much a power game, right? And it's very hard to introduce novelties. And that's why Kuhn half a century ago said that it takes generations to make a change. So we had to be realistic, but that doesn't mean that we did not need an effort in this direction. I'll give you like a very distant example, but maybe you will see this illusion, what I'm referring to. We have been talking about interdisciplinarity for a while now. But if you're applying for some grants, for instance, in my country, Czech Republic now, they're asking, what panel is that? Is it political science? Is it sociology? Is it history? I'm saying, no, it's area studies, it's an interdisciplinary. And they say, choose one of the three or you do not get the money. And the interdisciplinarity has been with us like much longer than the decolonization of East European studies. And it's still not, it is accepted as an idea. It helps us to meet at this wonderful gathering, but it does not work in real life. So, and the same applies to good peer review publications and so on and so forth. So once you're coming, challenging the hegemonic narrative, it does not help you to get published in the best outlets. So it's always a choice well, we are the community. It's not someone imposing the rules. We can change it, with our consolidated efforts. So my idea was to bring this idea on the table and to discuss with you, and maybe you have some good insights. But as I said, it's just like intuition. It's not, unfortunately, a program for further actions.
Thank you. Okay, we have a further question?
Me. I'm Katerina Kopchenko. My question is more to Victoria, and probably if Guido wants to add some words. It's a very simple question. Do you interpret the decommunization process in Ukraine also accepted with laws about it from 1915, so it's an official policy in Ukraine, in this concept of decolonization? Did you try to interpret it as local version of decolonization, or maybe national version of it? It was criticized first for some historians from abroad mostly, now less criticized. It's also received an additional meanings during the war against Russia, but probably you can comment. Yes.
It's a very interesting question. Thank you. A quick comment on the Ukrainian context is that all top-down initiatives are usually met with much harsher criticism than any grassroots one. And if we look at this famous Lenin apart or Lenin fall after the Revolution of Dignity, so for a year it was more spontaneous, more like from bottom up, and then it was somehow legitimized as a state policy. And then we see the sociological data that shows that the level of approval dropped down. So there is this, for many people in Ukraine, there is this allergy, if you wish, to any imposed policies from the state. And therefore I saw quite well argued criticism about this idea of like total deconstruction of all complicated and entangled historical legacies in Ukraine. Then after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, sociological data changed, but it is also open for interpretation. But then among the scholars who are working on the application of post-colonial, decolonial approach in Ukraine, there are strong voices that if we are playing seriously with this approach, and if we are looking at different types of colonialism, and in this respect, the white-to-white colonialism, taking, for instance, Ireland and Algeria as a sort of the closest approximation to the Ukrainian situation, then we need to recognize our part in the imperial project. And then we need to either reappropriate our imperial past, not only colonial past, or de-imperialize ourselves, not only to decolonize ourselves. So it's not binary the way it is presented and codified in the laws. It requires much more nuanced approach. So I would imagine to give much more agency to scholars, to refine it like conceptually, and to communities on the grassroots level, on basic level, to make decisions about specific places, names, monuments in their localities. That would be my answer.
Just one sentence. I can think about decommunization as a form of decolonization, yes. But of course, then it has to be added, what kind of decolonization is this? I mean, so we refer to one term like decolonization as kind of a universal global term, but in fact what we need, and as a historian, I'm maybe more sensible about this, is of course in what sense it is, or it does mean decolonization. This has to be added. This is essential because we need not just to have the term decolonization applied for Ukraine, but we need to get a closer understanding how we understand the term decolonization. How can we understand the term decolonization for Ukraine? And that's essential. That's the essential part.
could you elaborate on this a bit more? How would you, in the Ukrainian sense, understand the term decolonization? Where does it apply, and where does it not? Because I think because we're all employing this term decolonization, and I find it extremely important what you just said.
If we share the view that decolonization implies to give voice to marginalized groups and people, I think then it is in many respects, and I gave the example of the Holodomor, then you can speak of decolonization. If you have a state policy, the situation might be different. So it's not that I would apply the term decolonization, for all of Ukrainian history or post 1991, but you have to take a closer look at the context, and then you have to describe in concrete terms what it meant at specific moments. I think that's crucial. Otherwise, we historians can't work with the term.
Okay, so we have two further questions or comments on that. So who is it in the last row? Yeah, or second last row? Yeah.
Yes, it would be rather a comment because this is a problem which, of course, is my main concern: how to conceptualize this decolonization thing. And I think first, beforehand, it is of course refocusing on periphery, refocusing on subaltern groups. So I could be working with the concept, but as a historian of Soviet Ukraine, it puts difficulties to me, because Soviet Ukraine was, as you know, the secunda inter pares in governing the Soviet Union. And in this perspective, it of course wasn't a colony in the classical sense. And now recent research is refocusing on Soviet Ukrainian elite politics in order to concentrate resources in the Ukrainian Republic and to appropriate Soviet technology and even the part of Ukrainians or the role of Ukrainians in this what was for a long time called Russian technology, which was in fact at least East Slavic technology with a large role of Ukrainians in it. So I think that needs to be still discussed, and I'm really very I'm looking forward to the discussion with my Ukrainian colleagues, especially on Soviet Ukraine, because it is so trauma-ridden due to Holodomor and war experience and violence experience and Stalinism and Stalinist persecutions on the one hand, but on the other hand, it includes a history of Soviet boom and a post-war boom, to take it with the Hobsbawm. So I think this will be a very exciting discussion, but it will be a very hard discussion, I think, with my colleagues, because I feel it's simply, if I'm discussing it with my Ukrainian friends and kin, because I have a Ukrainian family as well, they simply do not want to discuss Soviet Ukraine. They want to leave it behind them. And so it is, I think, a very crucial thing. So this is a co-comment on how to decolonize these research ideas.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is with the term that we often use it in a black and white matter, and which easily brings us to the understanding of just objects or subjects of history. And of course, in most senses, we are both. But Frank?
Yeah, it goes just beyond this question. So if there's other questions directly related.
No, just...
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for two very insightful and very different talks, which I enjoyed actually very much. And I come to one term or concept you use, this epistemic imperialisms, which I I'm very much in favor of, but still, from a perspective of a historian, it's extremely difficult to imagine how to practice that. Just one example, if you look at knowledge production in late Tsarist Empire, there is no one consistent system, knowledge system, or one epistemological system which you could really grasp in a clear way. Of course, we have the Russian academic system, but if you look at medical knowledge production, there's also a German system. It's very much multi-layered. It has a very strong transcultural influence. So we could rather talk about elitist academic systems, but it's difficult really to figure out one imperialist system which works on it in a consistent way. So that makes it quite difficult, while the term is somehow appealing, of course, to destruct that. I'm struggling recently with a project on deconstructing the concept of the Russian soul, but it's not a clear the concept of the Russian soul. So it's also a sort of transcultural knowledge production behind that concept, which goes beyond any national or regional or borders of many systems. So that makes your right claim quite difficult to realize, at least in historical research. That's just a remark. I don't know if Guido Hausmann might know some examples where this you in your talk, Guido, you mentioned some new books. If that is a tendency, or if you see some examples for this, I would be happy to have that or to read that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Franziska Davies, I think we'll take your question in as well and then go back to you. And then we'll have a last question, I think, from the chat.
I would like to ask Guido to elaborate on this idea of writing Ukrainian history as European history, and maybe you could elaborate on how exactly you would go about doing that, kind of bridging this Western tradition of history writing and writing the history of Ukraine as something not quite connected to that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, comments.
Yeah.
I'm certainly cannot help you with historical methodologies, how to approach the Russian soul, but I can suggest you some works related again to post-colonial, decolonial studies, but also to symbolic geography and books like Inventing Eastern Europe. So the Russian soul is very much a colonizing metaphor of Russia as a sort of exotic internal other of the West. And this imaginary Russia, that's why it grounds so many Russophilic feelings. And when I'm talking, for instance, to my British students, and I'm asking, it's still fashionable to read Russian literature, and I'm asking why, because it is an alternative to the mainstream, which is kind of boring to follow the mainstream. So it's not like the real Russia, but it's like the imaginary Russia. And I'm asking why you're not reading Buryat poetry or Albanian novels. They say it's irrelevant. No, so you cannot gain any symbolic capital. So it has to do something with these hierarchies of cultural domination. So you have the top tier, the second tier, and the third tier. And then it's like a very useful notion when it shows that it's exotic but not exotic enough, and that is relevant because it's great enough to be admired. So I would deconstruct it with a post-colonial perspective, and then also, of course, the symbolic geography can be useful here too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a big question. Thank you, Franziska. How to writing history of Ukraine as European history? Certainly, it is not a history from the center. So from the let's go into modern history, then it's the history of the great powers. So this is not the case. So power inequalities plays a central role. We would write then European history from the margins. We would have to question key categories as for instance, the idea of the state in the 19th century, which is in the hegemonic discourse, it is a cultural something like the highest form of political cultural development. So you would have to question all these central terms of modern European history, and instead you would need to write in Ukrainian experiences, Ukrainian political culture, Ukrainian intellectual culture in it. That's still very, very, very general, but the first step is to go beyond the hegemonic narratives from, let's say, the 18th century. And there are kind of attempts into that direction from Southeastern European history to write these nations into the European history that could be examples for doing this. There are examples for World War I, like the book by Bourget and Gourney on World War I, which is a nice example for doing this. So at least, even if I can't give you somehow a big idea how to do it, there are for certain topics of themes, possibilities to write Ukraine into European history, or to write Ukrainian history as European history. So let's leave it with this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. With one, I think it should be the last question because we have to come to an end. But there's one question from the Zoom, and I put it to both of you. How different are academic and public perspectives on seeing Russia's war in Ukraine as a colonial war? So do we have different academic and public perspectives on seeing Russia's war in Ukraine as a colonial war?
Well, the very way this question is framed, it constructs the academia and the public as two coherent entities, which they are not, right? So there are like different actors and groups and powers in both entities. So if you ask me, of course, it's easier to sell the colonial argument in public debates because you do not need refined methodology to prove your point. So I would say that in its public currency, the word colonial is just a label for people sympathizing with the Ukrainian cause, with no academic depth. Again, it's like a generalization. If we look at the academic circles, it depends from where they're coming from. If it's about the historical perspective, that would be one story. If it's about the post-colonial studies, that would be a different story. So there is certain acceptance, but as of now, we have more of political usage of the term rather than academic elaboration on it, with several significant exceptions, which I have named already, like Vitaly Chernetsky and some other scholars. Yeah, and maybe if I can make a quick remark on what you said about decentering European history, I think it's hugely important, and it goes very much in line with what I said, that we need to revise our very understanding of greatness and smallness, who has the agency and who has the contribution. So we have made these shifts already. When we moved in our readings of history from what the elites are doing, from what people are doing, from the political history to social history. So now we need to make the same move geopolitically, from thinking about great powers making the history to looking how, and I do like this concept of imperiality by Laura Doyle. She says that we tend to look at minor actors as they are following in line with the strategies defined by big others. But actually, they survive and thrive in their very own peculiar way under the radar. And we need to focus and describe and disseminate that knowledge. And that, again, would balance our framework of history. Yeah.
Thank you. Guido.
I think I think that these are good ideas to have in mind the political sphere and the actors in between the empires, and I'm not sure if we can apply the term knowledge then, but there are experiences, there are languages, there are certain actors we see in the between the empires, and that's a possible path to go along.
Thank you. So thank you for this these first inputs, and I think this was a very good start for our discussion. I found it very interesting that we immediately touched upon the terms of colonial and decolonization. What does it mean? And also, Valeria, I think it is very important what you stressed right now, that we have this perception of important countries and non-important countries, which really means that we really have to check our own mental maps. And I think this, of course, is...
And metrics.
Absolutely.
And metrics, how we measure it, those maps, and how we structure them.
Okay, so thanks a lot. We'll have a brief break of 15 or 10 minutes. 15 minutes. And then we'll have a talk by Alexandra Matvichuk, you know, the Nobel Prize winner last year, one of the Nobel Prize winners last year, and Cornelia Konczal will chair the discussion. So thanks a lot for your attention.